The year 2026 is already halfway gone. At this time, we have received an experience shared by a military personnel who is currently serving and has been to the Strait of Hormuz. He reveals things to us that you may never hear anywhere else, and what he shares are realities that you need to prepare for because there is no time left. Quickly, tell us where you are watching from so that we can continue to pray for you and your family. I will now begin sharing today's experience. I am going to try to tell you what happened to me. I have started this several times and stopped. Not because I do not want to share it, but because I am afraid of not doing it justice. I am afraid of the words coming out wrong and people walking away with the wrong picture. I have sat down at this table on many nights and written a few paragraphs and then closed the document without saving it, because what I wrote did not feel honest enough or clear enough or close enough to what actually happened. I kept trying to find the right way to say it, and finally I realized that there is no perfect way. There is only my way, and the truth of what I experienced, and the responsibility I feel to share it as carefully as I can. So I am going to try. And this time I am going to keep going even when it feels inadequate, because the alternative is staying silent about something I was told not to stay silent about. I want to say something before I begin. I know how this kind of story sounds. I know that when someone says they died and came back and were shown things by God, a lot of people immediately think about television specials and books written to sell something. I understand that reaction. I am not asking anyone to simply take what I am about to say as truth without thinking about it. What I am asking is that you read it to the end before you decide what you think. Give it that much. That is a reasonable ask. I am a veteran. I served in the military for a number of years. I died. My heart stopped. Clinically, medically, that is what happened. The doctors and nurses can describe the physical side of it better than I can. What I can describe is what happened on the other side of that moment, because what happened there is why I am writing this at all. Let me be clear about who I am and what I am not. I am not a preacher. I have never stood at a pulpit in my life. I do not have a ministry or a church or an audience I am building. I am not writing this because I am getting something from it. There is no book deal. There is no speaking schedule being arranged. I am a private person who had something happen to him that he was specifically told to share. That is the beginning and the end of my reason for being here. When my heart stopped, there was a moment of confusion. That is the honest way to describe it. Not peace, not terror, just confusion. The kind of feeling you get when you wake up in a room you do not recognize and your brain is still catching up to where you are. And then that passed and something else replaced it. A sense of presence. Not a vague feeling, but something very specific and very real. Someone was there. I knew immediately that whoever this was, they knew me completely. Not just the facts of my life, but everything underneath the facts. Every thought I had ever had in private. Every moment I was ashamed of. Every moment I had been genuinely good when no one was watching. All of it known. And here is the thing that broke me open in those first moments. Knowing all of that, every dark thing and every small thing and every moment of failure, there was no condemnation. None. What I felt coming from that presence was something I can only call love, but that word does not really cover it. It was love that had no edge to it. Love that was not surprised by anything it knew about me. Love that had decided about me before I even had a chance to explain myself. I started to cry. I do not cry easily. Years of military training and the kind of experiences that come with it had built something in me that kept emotion at a controlled distance. I am not proud of that exactly, but it is true. And standing in that presence, all of that distance just collapsed. I cried like a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has finally been allowed to put it down. I want to describe what he showed me as carefully and as plainly as I can. I am going to take time with this because I believe the details are not small things. I believe everything I was shown for a reason, and I am doing my best to honor that. Every time I have sat down to write this, I have asked him to help me tell it right. I do not know if I have succeeded, but I have tried. The first thing he showed me was conflict, large, widespread, serious conflict. Multiple countries, multiple regions. The year was 2026. He made this clear to me not with a calendar or a sign, but in the way that information arrived during the whole vision, directly, without words, as a knowing that settled into me the same way any true thing settles in. There was no ambiguity about it. The year carried its own weight, its own certainty, and it arrived in me fully formed, the way a name arrives when someone speaks it clearly in a quiet room. I did not have to reach for it or interpret it. It was simply there, and I knew it the way I know my own name. The scene opened around me. I was not watching it from a safe distance. I was inside it. I was standing on ground that was torn up and dark, the kind of ground that has had things happen to it, things no ground should have to hold. The soil beneath my feet was not simply disturbed in the way that construction disturbs ground, or even in the way that farming disturbs it. This ground had been worked on by force, by the specific kind of force that human beings bring to bear on each other when they have decided that destruction is the only remaining language. It had a texture to it, a density of event, that I felt through the soles of my feet before I understood anything else about where I was. The sky above me was not gray like rain. It was the color of burning, a brownish gray that you only get when things are being destroyed. I have been close enough to that kind of sky before during my service. I recognized it before I understood anything else about where I was. There is a particular quality to that sky that is unlike weather. Weather moves through a place and leaves it essentially the same. That sky is made by what is happening on the ground beneath it, and it carries the character of what is happening beneath it. And when you have stood under it before, you do not need to see anything else to know what kind of place you are in. The smell hit me next, fuel and carbon, and underneath those, something worse. Anyone who has been near real violence knows that underneath smell. It is not something you forget, and it is not something you mistake for anything else. That smell was present, and it confirmed what my eyes were already telling me. It had a density to it in the vision, a physical reality, that told me I was not in a dream in the ordinary sense. Dreams are imprecise. They gesture at things without quite landing on them. This landed. The smell was specific in the way that only real things are specific. The way a real room smells different from any imagined room, because real things carry details that the mind alone cannot manufacture. I registered it with the part of me that had been trained to read environments quickly, to take in information and reach conclusions without having to walk through each step of the reasoning. The conclusion was immediate, and it was certain. Around me were people in different kinds of uniforms. Some had no uniform at all but carried weapons and moved with the kind of coordinated purpose that comes from training. Different equipment from what looked like different nations. I could hear the sounds of organized violence, that specific combination of sounds that is unlike anything else on Earth. But what I kept coming back to, what pulled at me hardest, was the faces. I keep thinking about the faces. I have thought about them almost every day since I came back. There is an expression that happens to people who have been in conflict for too long. Something behind the eyes goes very still and very far away, like the person is present in their body, but some part of them has gone somewhere safer. I have seen that expression on men I served with after extended deployments. It takes something out of you to see it on someone you know. To see it that widely, on so many different faces in so many different places in one vision, was something I felt in my chest before I felt it anywhere else. The expression was not uniform across all those faces. It varied in its texture, in how far along in its development it had come. Some faces showed it early, the first emergence of that particular stillness, as though the person was only beginning to understand what environment they had entered and what it was going to require of them. Others showed it in its fully established form, the way it looks when it has been the primary expression for so long that the face has reorganized itself around it, when the muscles that hold other expressions have simply stopped and called upon often enough to stay ready. I stood there and I looked at those faces, and something inside me that had been able to keep a certain distance from human suffering was quietly taken away. I did not get it back. I do not think it was meant to be given back. He moved me through different places, different parts of the world. Some I recognized from regions I had served in, particularly in the Middle East. Others looked like parts of Africa that I had studied but not been to personally. Southeast Asia, parts of Eastern Europe. The conflicts were not identical in their form. Some were formal, state against state, organized military forces facing each other across defined lines, with the infrastructure of war built up behind those lines, and the logic of war governing what happened between them. Others were the messier kind, irregular, harder to name and harder to end. The kind of conflict that does not have a clear beginning and will not have a clear ending, that exists in the spaces between formal categories and resists every effort to put it into a box where it can be managed. But they were all serious, and they were all doing the same thing to human beings regardless of their specific character. The form was different, the effect was not. I understood, moving through those different places, that the specific political or historical reasons for each conflict were real and were different from region to region, but that underneath all those differences was the same basic transaction, the same thing being taken from people, the same thing being destroyed in them, regardless of what the stated cause was or which flags were flying. He showed me ordinary people inside these conflicts, not just fighters, families that had been pulled out of lives they had lived for generations. There is something particular about the displacement of families who have been rooted in one place across multiple generations, something that is different in kind and not just in degree from other forms of loss. When a person loses a place they have lived for years, that is a serious loss. When a family loses a place they have lived for a century or more, when the specific address of that piece of ground has been part of the answer to who they are for longer than anyone living can remember, the loss carries a dimension that does not have an easy word for it. He showed me families carrying that kind of loss, physically carrying themselves out of places where their grandparents and great-grandparents had also carried themselves, and the weight of the generational dimension of it was visible in how they moved. Not just tired, not just frightened, something deeper and slower and heavier than those things. The grief in those images was not the dramatic kind. It was quiet. The worst grief is always quiet. It does not need an audience. It just sits in the body and shows in the eyes and keeps very still. He did not give me exact dates for each individual conflict. What he showed me was that these were happening within the span of the year 2026, and that the level of armed conflict happening globally during this time would be serious enough that even people who paid very little attention to international events would not be able to ignore it. The world would feel it. It would not be something happening quietly in the background that you could avoid if you chose your news sources carefully enough. It would be present in the general atmosphere of life, in a way that reached people who had spent years successfully avoiding awareness of what was happening in other parts of the world. The cumulative weight of it, the sheer extent of it across different regions simultaneously, would produce a quality of global experience that would be recognizable to anyone paying attention, a sense that the world had entered something, that it was inside something it had not been inside before, or had not been inside for a very long time. And then he showed me something underneath all of it, something about the root of it, not just the political reasons or the arguments about resources or the long histories of grievance between different peoples, though all of those things were visible and real, and he did not diminish any of them, or suggest they were unimportant as explanations of how specific conflicts began or why they continued. He showed me something deeper than all of that, a pattern that had been running through human history for a very long time, the impulse of people with power to take from people without it, to use other people as tools, to treat human lives as something disposable when they got in the way of what the powerful wanted. This impulse was not new. It had not originated in the 21st century, or the 20th, or in any century that could be clearly identified as its point of origin. He showed me it running back and back, further than recorded history could track cleanly, the same basic shape of behavior appearing in different costumes across different civilizations and different eras, always recognizable underneath the costume, always doing the same fundamental thing. He showed me this pattern like a thread running through centuries of human history, and he showed me it arriving in 2026 at a place of particular intensity. Not the worst it had ever been in absolute terms, but concentrated in a new way, distributed across regions in a new way, and operating in a world that had become interconnected enough that what happened in one place traveled to other places with a speed and completeness that earlier eras had not had to contend with. And then he showed me something that he would come back to again before the vision was over. He showed me that this pattern, this cycle of human beings taking from each other and harming each other and consuming each other, had one real interruption available to it. He made it very clear that the interruption was not going to come from military action or from political solutions or from economic pressure. Those things could shape events at the surface level. They could move pieces on the board. They could produce outcomes that were less destructive than they would otherwise have been, and he was not dismissing the value of that. But they could not reach the root. A solution that operates at the level of behavior and does not reach the level of what produces the behavior is not a solution to the thing itself, only to one expression of it. He showed me what it looked like when people who claimed to follow him actually stopped thinking about themselves and started praying for the people in those zones of conflict. Praying specifically. Praying persistently. Not as a religious habit, but as a real act. One person reaching toward God on behalf of another person who was suffering somewhere they might never visit and would probably never meet. He showed me this as the thing that everything else turned on, not a side note, the center. The weight of that first vision stayed in me even as the scene changed, like the cold that gets into your bones when you've been outside too long. By the time he moved me somewhere else, I was already different from the person who had arrived. The second thing he showed me was water. I was standing near a coastline. The ocean was already unsettled before anything happened. Moving with that particular energy that tells you something is coming that you cannot get ahead of. There is a quality that large bodies of water take on in certain atmospheric conditions that experienced people learn to read, not as an intellectual exercise, but as a felt thing, a communication from the environment that bypasses the analytical mind and lands directly in the body. The water was communicating. I received what it was communicating before anything visible had yet occurred. The sky was very dark and heavy, and there was something electrical in the air, the kind of feeling that makes your skin feel aware of itself. I stood there looking at the water, and I already knew, before anything had happened, that what I was about to see was going to be very bad. The water began to rise. It was not one big wave. I want to be clear about that because I think people picture a wave when they think about flooding, one dramatic crash, and then it recedes. This was not that. This was a sustained rising, a slow, steady, progressive advance of water inland. And the thing about it that was more frightening than any wave would have been was that it did not stop. It just kept coming. It moved over everything it reached, and it did not pull back. The water had a quality of inevitability to it that was more disturbing than violence would have been. Violence is still in dialogue with resistance. You can resist it, and sometimes the resistance changes the outcome. What I was watching did not enter into that dialogue. It simply moved. It rose and advanced and covered, and did not acknowledge anything in its path as a reason to reconsider. Streets disappeared. Then the lower floors of buildings. Then more. The water was patient, in a way that made it feel more powerful than something violent would have felt. He showed me a major coastal city somewhere in Asia. I could tell from the buildings and from something in the atmosphere of the place. The water had already been there long enough that the streets were completely under it. Only the tops of buildings were visible, the tops of traffic lights, the upper floors of large structures. And the silence. That is the thing I was not prepared for. A city underwater is not loud. It is extraordinarily quiet. The silence of it was harder to take than any amount of noise would have been. A city is among the loudest environments that human beings create. The specific texture of urban sound, the layering of traffic and voices and mechanical systems, and the thousand other things that cities produce acoustically is so constant and so dense that people who live inside it stop hearing it as separate components and simply experience it as the ambient presence of a place that is alive. To stand in a city and hear none of that, to have all of that sound replaced by the quiet particular to deep water, was a displacement of expectation so complete that it produced something close to physical vertigo. It was not simply the absence of sound. It was the presence of a silence that communicated something specific and terrible about what had happened to all the activity that had been generating all that sound. He moved me to a farming region in Africa, flatland, the kind of land where you can see a long way in every direction. The crops that people in that region needed in order to eat, and in order to sell, and in order to survive had been covered by water that had no business being there. The land had a particular quality that I recognized even without having been there personally, the specific flatness and light of certain African agricultural regions, the kind of terrain where the sky is enormous and the horizon is so far away that it takes on a theoretical quality. That kind of land, and the communities built on it and sustained by it, had been reached by water in a way that the geography did not seem to permit. The water had exceeded the logic of the land. That discrepancy between what the terrain suggested was possible and what had actually occurred was one of the things that registered most strongly. The flooding was not simply severe. It was categorically beyond what the people in that place had any framework for, any historical memory of, any preparation for. He showed me flooding in South America. He showed me parts of the United States where people had felt reasonably safe from this kind of event, regions that had not historically been flood zones, and those regions being surprised by water in ways they were not prepared for. The element of surprise was significant, and he drew my attention to it deliberately. Preparation changes what a disaster does to a community. Communities that have a history with a particular kind of disaster develop institutional knowledge, structural adaptations, cultural practices around response and recovery. Communities that encounter a disaster type for the first time have none of those things. The same event produces different outcomes depending on what the community brings to it, and communities encountering flooding for the first time were encountering it without any of the things that make a known disaster survivable in different ways than an unknown one. Parts of coastal Europe. Rivers on multiple continents going well past any level they had reached in recorded history. He showed me the things that happen after the water. The disruption to food, the movement of large numbers of people away from areas that they could no longer live in, the pressure on every kind of system that was supposed to help people in these situations. Those systems had been built with particular assumptions about scale, about what constituted a realistic worst case, and the events he showed me were operating outside those assumptions in ways that revealed exactly where the limits of the systems were. He showed me the connection between the flooding and what human beings had done to the natural world over a long time. He did not give me a scientific lecture. He did not use technical language. What he gave me was more like an understanding, a direct sense of it, that the line between what people had done to the earth and what the earth was now doing had become very thin. The distance between cause and consequence, which had been long enough that it was easy to ignore or dispute or simply not perceive, had collapsed to the point where the connection was no longer something a person needed specialized knowledge to understand. It was becoming legible in the most direct possible way through direct experience of it. This was not punishment in the sense of God deciding to make people suffer for being bad. He was clear about that. The distinction mattered to him, and he communicated it carefully. It was more like consequence. A world experiencing the results of its own choices over a very long period of time. The mechanism was not wrath. The mechanism was the way that physical systems work, the way they absorb and accumulate, and eventually express what has been put into them over time. He wanted me to understand this distinction, not as a theological technicality, but as something practically important about how to think about what was happening. The third thing he showed me was fire coming from the ground. I was standing on volcanic rock, the kind of dark, rough terrain that you find in places where the earth has made itself through eruption. The ground under my feet had been formed by fire, and you could feel it, a warmth rising up through the rock even where I was standing, a vibration that was very low and very constant, a smell of sulfur that sat at the edge of being too much and stayed just under it. The terrain had a quality that I want to try to describe accurately. It was not simply dark and rough in a neutral way. It communicated the history of what had formed it. There is a way that material objects carry the record of what has happened to them. Wood that has been in fire carries it. Metal that has been worked carries it. This ground carried the record of the specific violence that had produced it, and standing on it, you were in contact with that record in a physical way. The rock beneath my feet was the cooled residue of something that had been so hot and so forceful that it had come up through solid ground and remade the surface of the earth. Standing on it was a reminder of what the ground was actually capable of. Ahead of me was a mountain. I did not recognize it from any identifying feature, but I understood immediately that it was dangerous. There was something about the atmosphere around it, something in the air itself, that communicated danger the way a dog communicates danger before anything visible has happened. The mountain was not in eruption when I first saw it. It was simply present, and its presence was enough. Whatever was happening inside it was sufficient to produce a change in the air around it, a quality to the atmosphere in that direction that registered as warning before any of the visible signs had presented themselves. I stood looking at it, and I was aware of the gap between how permanent it looked from the outside and what I already understood was happening inside it. The eruption started slowly. Before anything broke through the surface, there was a deep sound that came from inside the earth. The kind of sound that you feel in your chest before your ears fully register it. It was not a loud sound in the conventional sense. It was a sound that bypassed the ordinary experience of hearing and registered first as a physical sensation, a vibration in the body, and only secondarily as something the ears reported. It was also a sound that, once heard, communicated something precise and immediate about its source. There was no ambiguity in it about where it was coming from or what it meant. Then the smoke above the mountain thickened. Then the color of the sky around the peak began to change. And then the lava came down the slopes, and it moved with that particular slow certainty that is more frightening than anything fast. If something moves fast, you can at least tell yourself there is a chance. Something that moves slowly and absolutely and does not stop for anything lets you know exactly what is going to happen. There is nothing to negotiate with. The slowness of it is the statement it is making. The statement is that it does not need to hurry because the outcome is already determined and everything in its path already belongs to it, even if it has not arrived there yet. He showed me more than one volcanic event. He made me understand that the period of 2026 would see an increase in this kind of activity in several different regions, not all in one country or one area. Multiple places. The geographic distribution of it was part of what he wanted me to understand. It was not a single localized event that could be explained by the particular conditions of a single location. It was something distributed, something that reflected a state of the earth itself across multiple regions simultaneously. He showed me the effects beyond the immediate eruption, ash traveling hundreds of miles, affecting air travel over large areas, settling onto farmland and reducing sunlight in ways that affected crops. The reach of a major volcanic event extends far beyond what the immediate images of lava and fire suggest. The ash in the atmosphere changes what reaches the ground hundreds of miles away. It changes what those agricultural systems can do. It enters the food supply at a distance from the eruption that people who had not thought carefully about these connections would not have anticipated. Communities that had lived for generations on the slopes of these mountains. Because that volcanic soil is some of the most fertile soil on Earth, those communities having to leave quickly and permanently. There was one image from this part of the vision that I have not been able to let go of. It was not dramatic in its visual content. It did not involve destruction actively occurring or anything that would be striking in an objective description. What made it stay with me was what it contained, what was compressed into the stillness of it. There was in it a completeness of loss, a finality that was expressed through absolute stillness rather than through any movement or sound. That said more about the cost of what was happening than any amount of active imagery could have communicated. That one image said more to me about what it costs human beings to lose their home than any amount of large-scale footage could have. It was so small and so quiet and so final. The fourth thing he showed me was the earth moving. I was in a city, a modern city, the kind of place that communicates permanence and stability in everything about it. Tall buildings that looked like they had been built to last for centuries. Wide streets, well maintained. The infrastructure of a prosperous contemporary society visible in every direction. There is a particular confidence that contemporary urban environments project, a statement embedded in their architecture and their engineering and their scale. that says human beings have learned enough and built well enough that the environment they have constructed can be treated as a given, a stable background against which daily life proceeds without the ground itself being a variable. I was standing in that environment and I was aware of how solid everything felt, how built for endurance, how far removed from the idea of collapse. And then the ground moved. I have felt small earthquakes before. They are brief and disorienting and unpleasant, but they pass and you remind yourself that it was nothing. What I experienced in the vision was not nothing. The ground moved with sustained, building violence. Not a single jolt that ends and returns everything to stillness. A progressive shaking that grew in intensity and kept going, that escalated in a way that removed the possibility of telling yourself it was nearly over, because each moment it was worse than the moment before, and there was no information available about where the escalation would stop. The buildings around me, those symbols of everything stable and permanent, began to fail. Not all at once. The glass went first. I watched it cascade from upper floors in sheets, the sound of it reaching me a fraction of a second after the sight of it, the way sound travels a little slower than light. Then structural elements began to move in ways they were not built to move. Then entire sections of buildings began to come down. There is a sound that large structures make when they fail. I do not know how to describe it properly. It is a combination of things, the cracking of materials under stress, the crash of things falling, the grinding of heavy things, settling into wrong positions. It is not like any sound you hear in everyday life. Every material that goes into a large building has its own acoustic signature when it fails, and in a structural collapse you hear all of those signatures simultaneously and in sequence, layered in a way that the ear cannot fully separate or process. It stays with you, not as a memory that you can retrieve at will exactly, as something more like a residue, something that has been deposited in you and that makes itself felt in moments you did not anticipate, in reactions to sounds or images that carry some partial resemblance to what you heard, and therefore call up what you heard as though it is present again. He moved me through several cities experiencing this. Different locations, different scales. He showed me a major earthquake affecting what appeared to be a major American city. The ground had opened in some places, streets had buckled and separated. The infrastructure that people relied on every single day, bridges, water systems, power, had been severely damaged across a large area all at once. The simultaneity of it was part of what he wanted me to understand. A disaster that is contained to one area can be addressed by resources from unaffected areas. The surrounding region provides the response capacity. But when the disaster extends across the entire region simultaneously, when every part of the system is affected at the same time, there is no unaffected part to respond from. The systems that would normally activate to respond to a crisis were themselves among the things that the crisis had damaged. I saw the emergency response, and I saw how different it was when the disaster was everywhere in a city simultaneously rather than contained to one area. The people who understood emergency response, who had trained for it and prepared for it, were doing what they knew how to do. But the environment they were working in had changed the parameters of every calculation they had made in their preparation, because the preparation had been built on assumptions about what resources would be available and from where, and those assumptions were no longer valid. He placed a particular emphasis on one location. Along with that emphasis came something I am going to try to describe as carefully as I can, because I have thought about it many times, and I want to say it exactly right. There was a name connected to a significant seismic event in the United States. The name, as I received it, sounded like Eureka. He connected this name to a major earthquake that was among the events coming in this period. I am not embellishing this. I am not interpreting it or adding to it. I am sharing it exactly as it came to me, as plainly as I can. I do not know what city or region or place exactly this referred to. What I know is that it was connected to something significant and that it was in the United States. I have sat with that detail many times. I have wondered whether I heard it correctly. I have wondered whether the name I received was precise or approximate. I have not tried to make it fit any particular interpretation. I have not done research to find which American city or region or geological feature might correspond to it in a way that seemed satisfying. That is not what I was given the detail for. I was given it to share, not to decode. Whatever understanding is meant to come from it will come to whoever it is meant to reach, and it will come in a way that is appropriate to them and to the moment they receive it in. I share it because I was told to share what I was shown, and that was part of what I was shown. I leave the rest of the understanding to whoever receives it. Throughout all 4 of these visions, I want to say something that I have not been able to say adequately yet. He was with me through all of it. He was not somewhere else, showing me images on a screen while he went about other business. He was present with me in each scene. That presence was the one constant in every location, every kind of destruction, every image of suffering. And that presence carried a quality that I struggle to put into words. The language I have for describing the experience of another person's presence is built from a lifetime of human experience. And what I was experiencing was not human presence, even though it had qualities that the language for human presence reaches toward. It was the feeling of someone who cares deeply about what they are showing you, who is not detached from it, who looks at every suffering person in every image, something that I would call grief, except it was bigger than any grief I have ever seen in a human being. Love and grief together, held at the same time, with a capacity and a completeness that had no ceiling on it. The grief was not bounded by the limits of what one person can hold. It was proportionate to the actual scale of the suffering, which meant it was enormous, and yet it did not collapse under its own weight, the way human grief collapses when it becomes too much to carry. It held. It was completely present to the full weight of what it was feeling, and it held. He was not indifferent to any of it. That mattered to me enormously, and it still does. The fact that he was not watching the suffering of millions of people from some comfortable distance. He was in it with them, and he was in it with me as I watched. At a certain point, he turned toward me, and I felt that the vision was moving toward something. Like he had been showing me the parts, and now he wanted me to understand the whole. There was a gathering quality to it, the way a conversation has a gathering quality, when the person you are talking to has been building towards something and is now ready to arrive at it. Everything that had preceded it was preparation for this. Not preamble in the sense of something preliminary that you wait through. Preparation in the sense of something that was itself necessary, that had to be seen and carried before the thing it was preparing you for could be properly received. He revealed to me that everything I had seen was not a collection of separate events that happened to be occurring around the same time. It was a season, a concentrated period in which multiple serious things would be active at once, in different parts of the world, within the same general span of time. Not all on one day, not all in one place, but close enough together and serious enough individually that the total weight of it, felt by people living through it in different parts of the world, would have a common quality. It would feel like the world was coming apart. Not in the sense of a metaphor or an exaggeration of the way difficult times often feel. In the more literal sense of a simultaneous destabilization across multiple domains and multiple regions that would produce in the people living through it a genuine and well-founded sense that the foundational conditions of life had shifted, that something had changed at a level deeper than current events, deeper than politics or economics, at the level of what could be counted on. He made something very clear to me, and I want to be equally clear in passing it on. This was not the end of the world. I need to say that plainly because I know how easily people can go to that place when they hear about multiple disasters occurring together. What he showed me was not the final days of human history. He was showing me a very hard season within human history, a season that would bring enormous suffering to many people in many places, but a season, not an ending. The distinction mattered to him, and he communicated it with great deliberateness. I understood that he wanted whoever heard this to hold both things at once. The seriousness of it, which was real and should not be minimized or reframed into something more comfortable, and the fact that it was a season, which had implications about what was possible within it and what came after it. And then he showed me something that I was not expecting, something that shifted the whole picture. He showed me people turning to God during this season. Not a small number of people, large numbers, in many parts of the world, in communities and populations where Christian faith had very little presence before this. He showed me people who had lived their entire lives without seriously considering God, finding themselves in the middle of circumstances that had stripped away every other thing they had relied on for certainty and stability. The stripping was not abstract or metaphorical. The things that had provided stability, the institutions, the physical environments, the systems and structures and conditions that people had organized their sense of security around, had been visibly, undeniably disrupted. Not in ways that could be explained away or recovered from quickly enough to restore the previous sense of reliable normalcy. In ways that revealed how much of what people had been treating as permanent was not. And in that stripped-down place, with nothing else left to hold on to, turning toward him with a sincerity and an urgency that they had never had before. The quality of the turning mattered. It was not nominal or habitual or social. It was the turning of people who had arrived at a place with nothing else available to them and had found something there. He was very clear that this turning, this movement of souls toward him in the middle of the difficult season, was not a side effect of the disasters. It was one of the most significant things happening in the whole picture. The disasters were large and visible, the kind of thing that produces footage and headlines and global awareness. The movement of people toward him was less visible from the outside, the kind of thing that happens in interior spaces, in quiet and in private, and the specific kind of honesty that a person can only reach when the circumstances they are in have removed the option of pretending. But he showed me that from where he was, it was the thing he was watching most closely, the thing he cared about most in everything that was unfolding. I want to sit with that for a moment because I think it is easy to read past it. He was not showing me disasters as the main story. He was showing me the movement of human souls as the main story, and the disasters as the context in which that movement was happening. The disasters were real, and he grieved them. Every life lost in them mattered to him in a way that was specific and total, not general or aggregate. But the disasters were also the context, the environment, the set of conditions within which something was happening that he regarded as primary. The reframing of that is significant, and I have thought about it many times since I came back. We are trained by everything about the way we receive information about the world to regard the large visible events as the primary things, the things that matter most, the things that history is made of. He was showing me that the primary thing is not always the visible thing. The primary thing is not always what produces the most striking imagery or the most widespread awareness. From where he stands, the primary thing is what is happening to human souls, and that happens in a register that the visible events only rarely capture. He then spoke to me about prayer in a way that I had honestly never thought about it before. I grew up going to church. I have prayed my whole life in the way that a person who grew up in church prays. Regularly, sometimes sincerely, sometimes by habit, sometimes not entirely sure what I was doing, or whether any of it was reaching anywhere. I sat through prayers in services and said prayers at meals and said prayers at night before sleeping. Prayer had been a practice, a discipline, a habit, a form. It had been something I did and something I believed in as a matter of conviction, without always being certain what I was believing in exactly. I thought I understood what prayer was. I did not understand what prayer was. He showed me what prayer actually is. He showed me that sincere, specific prayer arrives somewhere real. It is not words sent out into a room with no one listening. It is not a private practice that helps the person doing it feel better while nothing else happens. He showed me prayer from the position of the one receiving it. He showed me what a genuine intercession for someone who is suffering looks like from where he stands. I am going to be honest and say that I cannot find words for what I saw there. The experience of seeing that was not something I can translate into language with any confidence that the translation is accurate. What I can tell you is that it changed the way I think about prayer completely and permanently. The way I thought about it before and the way I think about it now are not the same thing. They are not close to the same thing. They do not sit on a continuum with each other. There is a categorical difference between them, and the experience of seeing what I saw is what put that difference there. There is no going back to the old way. He showed me groups of believers who were praying specifically for regions that were in danger. Not general prayers about peace in the world, prayers that name everything and therefore in practice name nothing, prayers that gesture toward the category of suffering without landing on any particular instance of it. Specific prayers, named places, situations, named people sometimes. The specificity was significant in a way he drew my attention to deliberately. There is a difference between a general concern and a specific act. A general concern can be held without cost, without commitment, without the discipline of returning to it day after day. A specific prayer is a different kind of thing. It requires the person praying to bring a particular place or person or situation into their full attention, to hold it there, to return to it, to refuse to let the natural drift of attention carry it away. It is a more demanding act than general concern, and it is also a more real one. And he showed me the effect of that prayer on those regions. He was careful to show me something I think people need to hear. The danger did not always disappear. The events were not always stopped. People still suffered. He was not showing me prayer as a magic formula that removes all consequences from a situation, that inserts itself between a disaster and its effects and simply cancels them. But specific people were protected who would not otherwise have been. The path through the suffering was different for those who had been prayed for. The mercy available inside a disaster was larger and more present than it would have been without the prayer. He showed me this not as a theological principle that you accept by faith. He showed it to me as something visible and real. The difference between a place that had been prayed over and a place that had not was a difference I could see. It was not subtle. It was not something I had to look for or interpret. It was simply present, the way a fire produces visible light rather than requiring you to believe theoretically that fire produces light. I thought about everyone I had ever prayed for, all the way back to childhood. I thought about every time I had said a quick prayer for someone, and moved on with my day, not entirely sure it had done anything. He showed me that it had done something, that every sincere prayer had arrived, that none of them had gone nowhere. That changed something in me that I am still adjusting to, because it means that the entirety of my prayer life, every moment of it, every sincere reaching toward him on behalf of another person, had been real in a way I had only partially believed. The doubt I had sometimes carried about whether any of it mattered was a doubt about something that, from where he stood, was not in question. It had always mattered. The arrival had always happened. The question had only ever been on my side of it. He was not sending me back primarily to make people afraid. He was not sending me back to be someone who walks around announcing terrible things are coming. There is a version of this kind of experience that produces that. A person whose primary mode becomes the announcement of disaster, who relates to what they have been shown primarily as a warning and secondarily as nothing else. That was not what he was sending me back as. He revealed something to me that I understood to contain both a warning and an invitation. The warning was real. The things I was shown are real, and I believe the people who hear this should take them seriously. But the invitation was at least as important as the warning, maybe more important. The invitation was to prayer, specific prayer, persistent prayer, intercession for people in places that are in danger, even if you will never visit those places or meet those people. The geographic and cultural distance that we experience between ourselves and suffering in other parts of the world is a distance that he does not experience. From where he stands, there is no part of the world that is far away. There is no suffering that is too remote to matter. And he showed me that when we pray, we are participating in something that operates from his position, not from ours. The distance that limits us does not limit what prayer does, because prayer does not travel through the geography that limits us. He also told me something about the years ahead, beyond 2026, that I believe applies more broadly. He showed me that the next several years would be a time of testing for people who call themselves Christian, all around the world. Not the same kind of testing in every country. The specific pressure would be different in different places. In some places it would be external, a social or legal or political pressure that made following him costly in practical terms. In other places it would be internal, a pressure produced by the difficulty of maintaining genuine faith in conditions that were themselves difficult, where the easy version of faith would not hold, and the only thing that would hold was the thing that had been genuinely built. But there would be a general pressure. A pressure that would test whether the faith people had was genuine trust in God or whether it was something else, habit, comfort, the identity that comes from belonging to a community, the sense of being a good person that church attendance can give. These things are not nothing, but they are not faith. And the testing season would reveal the difference between them and faith in a way that would be clear to anyone who experienced it. He showed me that some of what had been called faith would not survive that testing, not because God abandoned those people, but because the thing they had called faith was not what they thought it was. When the pressure came, it would reveal what was real and what was only the shape of something real. But he also showed me the other side, and I want to make sure I do not leave this out because it would be very unfair to stop halfway through. For the people whose faith was real, whose relationship with him was genuine and had been genuinely walked out, day after day in ordinary conditions, without the drama of crisis requiring them to rise to something, he showed me what the testing season would produce. Not despite the difficulty, but through it. The difficulty was not incidental to what it produced. It was the mechanism. What the difficulty would do to genuine faith was not damage it. It would do the opposite. It would take what was already in them and deepen it. The way heat changes certain materials not by destroying them, but by making them harder and more durable than they were before. There is a transformation available to material under the right kind of pressure that is not available to it in the absence of that pressure. The pressure is the condition for the transformation, not a threat to it. He showed me this not as a compensation for the difficulty, a way of saying the difficulty was worth it because of what came after. He showed it to me as the actual mechanism, the specific way the testing season would work on people who had built their faith on something real. Those people would come out of the season more certain of his reality than they had been when it began. Not more certain as a matter of intellectual conviction, though that too. More certain in the deeper way, the way that certainty settles into you when you have tested something under conditions that would have exposed it if it were not what you thought it was. They would have things to say to the new believers who were just arriving, things they could only say because of what they had been through. The things you can only say from the other side of something have a quality that the things you can say without having been through it do not have. There was something like a handoff in what he showed me. The people who had walked with him through the difficulty and the people who had found him because of the difficulty, meeting each other on the other side of it, and what the longer walking ones had to offer the newly arrived ones being exactly what the experience of the difficulty had produced in them. The two groups needing each other in a way that the difficulty had created. He gathered the whole vision together near the end. He brought everything he had shown me, the conflict, the water, the fire in the earth, the shaking ground, the souls turning, the prayers going up, all of it, and he held it together in a way that made it feel like one thing rather than several separate things. The integration of it was something I felt rather than something I reasoned to. It was not that I worked out the connections between the different parts and concluded that they belonged to a single picture. The single picture was given to me whole, and it simply became clear that what I had been shown in parts was always one thing, that the parts had always been parts of it, that the wholeness of it had been present all along and was now simply visible. And then he came back to what he had shown me at the very beginning of the conflict vision. The thing that he had said was the center of everything. He revealed to me again with great emphasis that the pattern of human beings taking from each other and harming each other had one genuine interruption available to it. The interruption was not military or political or economic, though none of those things were useless or irrelevant. The interruption was spiritual. It was one person praying for another person. It was intercession replacing predation, prayer where taking had been. He showed me these two things as opposites, not as supplements to each other. As genuine opposites, as far apart as two orientations toward another human being can get. One treats another person as a resource, as something that exists to serve a purpose that has nothing to do with the person themselves, as a means to an end where the end belongs entirely to the one doing the taking. The other treats another person as someone worth standing before God on behalf of. Someone worth spending time and attention and the specific kind of effort that sincere prayer requires on behalf of, without receiving anything from them in return, without even necessarily knowing who they are. The contrast between those two orientations is not one of degree. They are not on the same spectrum. They represent opposite answers to the most fundamental question available about how a person relates to another person. And he showed me that the thing that was driving the worst of what was coming was one of those answers, and the thing that reached deeply enough to actually interrupt it was the other. Before he sent me back, he made me understand one more time, very clearly, that what I had been shown was not for me alone. He did not show me these things so that I could have an interesting story to think about, or so that I could carry a private knowledge of what was coming. He showed me these things so that I could share them, so that whoever heard them would take them seriously, so that the people who prayed would pray with more urgency and more specificity than they had before, because they now understood something about what prayer actually is and what it actually does, so that the people who had not yet made up their minds about God might feel something stirring in them when they heard about the souls turning toward him in the middle of the disasters, and might ask themselves which side of that turning they wanted to be on. He sent me back with a task. The task was not to predict. The task was not to warn in the narrow sense of simply delivering bad news to people so that they could be aware of it. The task was to share what he had shown me in a way that was complete enough that the invitation in it could be heard alongside the warning. The invitation was the more important of the two. He was clear about that. I came back. Coming back into my body was its own experience, and I am not going to try to describe it fully here because I do not have the words for it, and also because it is not the point. The point is that I came back different. Everything I have just described I carried back with me. The weight of those faces in the conflict vision, the silence of the flooded city, the sound the large structures made when they failed, the sight of new believers in unexpected places, the understanding of what prayer actually is and what it actually does. All of it came back with me and none of it is faded. The usual process by which intense experience gradually loses its immediate quality and becomes memory, becomes something you can access but are no longer inside of, has not operated on this the way it operates on other things. It is not that I am perpetually in the vision, but the things I understood there, the things I felt there, the things I came to know there, have not retreated into the distance that memory usually puts between a person and their past experience. They have remained close. People who know me well have asked me how I am different. It is a hard question to answer quickly. The short version is this. I used to be able to hold suffering at a distance. I cannot do that anymore. Not since those faces, not since being in those scenes and feeling the weight of them. The distance was not indifference. I want to be clear about that. I cared about suffering before. I was not someone who was unaware of it or unconcerned by it. But there is a way of being concerned about suffering that still allows you to move through your day with the suffering held at a certain remove, present in the background of your awareness, without making constant claims on the foreground of your attention. That distance, whatever its precise character was, whatever its sources were, has been removed. I feel things differently now, and I am still learning what to do with that. I also pray differently, very differently. I pray with a specificity and an intentionality that I did not have before. I think about where the prayer is going. I think about the person or the region or the situation I am praying for as if they are real and present, because he showed me that from where he stands, they are. The distance that we feel between ourselves and suffering happening in another part of the world is a distance that he does not feel. The person suffering in a region I will never visit is not, from where he stands, remote. They are present to him with the same completeness and specificity that I am present to him. And when I pray for them, I am participating in something that operates from that position, that crosses the distance I feel completely, because the distance I feel is not a feature of the reality he inhabits. It is a feature of the reality I inhabit. Prayer crosses from my reality into his, and what it does from there is not limited by the geography of my experience. I think about 2026. I am honest about that. I think about it when I read the news. I think about it when I see things building in certain directions. I carry the awareness of it not as a source of anxiety, but as a source of orientation. It tells me where I am in time. It tells me what the time I am in is for. I am not walking around in fear. Fear is not what he sent me back with. What he sent me back with is urgency. And there is a difference between those two things that matters enormously. Fear and urgency can look similar from the outside, can both produce a heightened relationship with the present moment and a heightened awareness of what is at stake. But they are fundamentally different in their character and in what they produce in the person carrying them. Fear closes things down. It reduces the horizon. It makes the person carrying it smaller and more reactive and less capable of the things that the moment requires. Urgency opens things up. It clarifies. It says there is still time, and what there is still time for is meaningful, and the doing of it matters. It says there is still time to pray. There is still time to turn. There is still time to ask. I think that is the core of what he wanted me to share. Not primarily the disasters, as real and as serious as they are. The disasters are the context. The core is the invitation. He is inviting people to pray. He is inviting people who have been away from him to turn back. He is asking the people who are already walking with him to walk more seriously, more deliberately, more prayerfully in the time that is coming. More seriously in the sense that the things they have been treating as secondary within their faith, the disciplines of intercession, the practice of praying with specificity for people in places of danger, deserve to move from the margin of their practice toward the center of it. More deliberately in the sense of making choices about how to use the time and attention available to them, with an awareness of what those choices are actually choosing between. More prayerfully in a way that encompasses all of it. A return to the understanding that prayer is not a supplement to the real activity of life, something done before the actual work begins. Prayer is itself one of the most real activities available to a human being, perhaps the most real one, because it is the activity that operates from the position of the one who is not limited by the distances and the conditions that limit everything else. He showed me that this matters, not as a comforting idea, not as an article of faith that you hold in the abstract because the tradition you were raised in holds it, as a visible, real, demonstrable truth that he invited me to see from where he stands and that I saw and that I cannot unsee. Prayer matters. Intercession matters. The gap between where you are and where the suffering is does not limit what prayer can do, because prayer does not travel through that gap. It arrives at the other side of it through a mechanism that operates independently of that gap entirely. He showed me this, and I believe it with everything I have, not because I was raised to believe it, but because I was shown it. Those are different kinds of belief. And the second kind is the kind I came back with. It is not going anywhere. It has not diminished since I came back. If anything, it has continued to settle more deeply into me, the way a true thing settles when you keep returning to it and keep finding it still there. I am going to close with the thing that he gave me first, before any of the visions, before any of the warnings or the invitations or the things he needed me to see. He made it clear that I was loved. Not people in general, me specifically, with everything he knew about me, and he knew all of it. And if he knows all of that about me and still held me the way he held me in that place, then he knows all of that about you too. About every person who reads this. There is nothing you carried that he does not already know. There is nothing in your history that surprised him. And knowing all of it, he is still reaching toward you. That is the thing he most wanted me to know, and I believe it is the thing he most wants you to know too. Not the disasters, not the warnings, not even the invitations, as important as those are. The first thing, the most basic thing, that you are known, and that you are loved, and that neither of those things is in question, no matter what season you are in or what season is coming. I have done my best to tell this honestly. I know some people will read it and dismiss it. I understand that. I am not asking anyone to accept it without question. I'm only asking that whoever reads it takes it seriously enough to sit with it, to ask themselves what they think, to perhaps, if nothing else, spend some time in prayer, even uncertain prayer, even the kind that says, I do not know if you are listening, but I am going to try. That is where I am leaving this. That is what I was sent back to say.